It is a great pleasure to introduce Bo Forbes to you, because isn't this, when you hear her speak, you'll see why it was perfect that Sattvic presented all of this information to us, which is so inspiring. She is a clinical psychologist, a yoga teacher, a yoga therapist, an author. She brings in biopsychology, neuroscience, stress management. She has her integrative yoga therapeutics, her yoga for emotional balance. She's founder of an online course, Embodied Awareness. One of the key things about her is she brings these understandings from neuroscience and neuroplasticity and her wonderful knowledge of psychology into the practice of yoga, and she does it seamlessly. So I'm sure you will get a sense of that as she presents. She's a pioneer in helping us bring all of this into our practice of yoga.
So I have to confess that as the only girl this morning, I got permission to temporarily take this off because it clashes with the outfit.
But it is for you to take home.
To take home, yes.
As a souvenir.
All right. So what I'd like to do this morning is to talk about an element of our existence that in some yoga traditions may be overlooked at times, and in others may be overemphasized, and that is the body. So this morning is about the body, and in particular, the body in yoga as a contemplative practice, which we'll be hearing more and more about as time goes on. So we could ask the question, what might the body mean for us in contemplative practice? What might it do for us? And is the body just something to move beyond on the way to enlightenment? Or could it actually be a conduit for liberation? And this morning I'd like to address those questions and more, and to talk about what do those questions mean for us as yoga therapists? What practical application do they have as we work with clients and as we engage with the field of bodily awareness in our own practice? So this research focus that we'll look at this morning, it applies to anxiety, depression, chronic pain, eating disorders, addictions, and gut issues, including irritable bowel syndrome. So what does it mean to inhabit the body, to be embodied? And that's something that in yoga we often take for granted. Of course I'm in my body, I do yoga. And it's not necessarily the case. Jon Kabat-Zinn talks about mindfulness as the ability to pay attention deliberately with awareness in the moment and non-judgmentally to our present moment experience. And so what we could say is that to be embodied is to have mindfulness in the body. That means that we pay attention non-judgmentally, on purpose, to this momentary awareness in the body as it fluctuates from one moment to the next. So this direct experience, this sensory experience we have in the body is actually one of the hottest new research areas in affective neuroscience as well as cognitive neuroscience. And I'd love to talk about it with you. It's my current geeky passion. So embodiment can be also called interoceptive awareness or interoception. And that means basically that mindfulness in the body. So if you imagine that we have a continuum of embodiment, it's not either you're in or you're out, but there's a continuum. And on one end over here you have exteroception. In the middle you have proprioception. And on the far end you have interoception. So what does that mean? Let's break it down a bit. Exteroception is what you're doing right now, which is to focus your awareness on something outside your body, on a screen, or on the words I'm saying, or planning out what you're going to have for lunch and where are there vegan options or gluten-free options. But it's when focus is directed outside of the body, what's happening outside of us. Proprioceptive awareness, and it's often confused with interoceptive awareness, is what's happening inside my body in the sense of where is it in space. For example, if I didn't have proprioceptive awareness, I could easily fall off the stage, crash into the podium, or land in Dilip's lap. And we don't want that this morning. So what I'd love to do with you all is to try a little experiment and have you close your eyes slowly. And this is not a test. No one's monitoring cortisol levels, nor are they looking at you. But take your right index finger or left, it could be dominant or not, and with your eyes closed, no peeking, slowly bring that finger to your nose. And then when you reach your nose, notice where did the finger land? And then slowly open your eyes. And if it landed on your eye or on your cheek, as sometimes happens, that means this morning our proprioceptive awareness may be a little bit off. So we all fluctuate on this continuum. Proprioceptive practices are movement practices that we see in yoga, and often they're thought of as advanced practices. And then we come to interoception. And interoception really talks about what's happening inside our bodies in this very moment as the moment moves from one to the next. So if you'll take a moment and just hold an arm out to the side, and you'll overlap with other people and you can say hello that way in a tactile kind of way this morning. And as you hold the arm out, in the very beginning you might notice, well, I can kind of feel that I'm using my arm muscles, my shoulder is active. Then start to track your breath a little bit. Are you breathing through your nose, in and out? And then as you breathe from moment to moment, sensation will start to change a little in the body. Other muscles will recruit to hold the arm up. You might start to feel a sensation of pain, or breath might become a little more rapid. And so noticing what changes now, and can you feel the sense of air on your skin, that sense of soft touch, that's also part of interoceptive awareness. And then slowly lower your arm. So very distinct from basic movements. And some of the sensations, what's happening in our body, could be breath tracking. That's one of the major ones. Heart rate, hunger and fullness, or satiety, abdominal fullness and distension. And let's make a note of that because it becomes very important in IBS. Often people with irritable bowel syndrome don't have the capacity to tell when they're full and when they're hungry. And the same is true of eating disorders of all kinds. And we also can look at sexual arousal and soft touch, and there are others as well. Now, it's kind of interesting because in cognitive and affective neuroscience, to measure interoceptive awareness is not so easy. And I thought I would give you this morning two of the popular ways that it's being done right now. One is to tell a group of practitioners, we're going to give you a drug now that will increase your heart rate. And half the people get the drug, the other half do not. And then you talk to people and say, well, did your heart rate go up? So this idea of predictability, someone told me this will happen, I'm seeking that sensation in my body and I've found it. So that's not quite the same as interoceptive awareness. And the other one, and I don't know, we're in mixed company, but is to inflate a balloon in someone's rectum and ask them to tell you the moment at which they feel full. Which study would you like to be a part of? So we don't have easy ways to do it, but we are, and I say we because I'm working, and I'll tell you a little bit about this, with Norman Farb and Dave Vago, who are two of Mind and Life's neuroscientists. And we are looking at working with muscle tension as another interoceptive awareness cue, rather than use either the drug or the balloon. So this is what good yoga looks like to a lot of America. I can't tell you how many times people say to me things like, I would love to practice yoga, but I'm not very flexible. Or I would love to practice, but I'm out of shape and I can't do it. Interoceptive awareness, and I can tell you this from experience because I go around selling this form of awareness in some ways, it's not very sexy. But as it turns out, it might just be vitally important to your health and your longevity. So let's take a closer look at some of the studies. First, just to acknowledge that being deeply in the body is not an easy thing to do. It's kind of scary, even without a history of trauma. You can imagine that going into this interoceptive space is like entering a wilderness, and you don't know what you're going to find in that wilderness. It could be raining, or there could be saber-toothed tigers, but there's a sense that we're never quite prepared for what we'll find, and also that that lack of preparation could be a good thing, could be healthy for us. But as it turns out, when we get good at going into this awareness, we realize that the experiences that fluctuate there mirror our emotional lives, that sense of fluctuation of emotional tone. One moment sadness, one moment desolation or grief, or missing a loved one who's passed, or a sense of happiness and lightness. So we have these two oscillating, fluctuating worlds, one of which is at our awareness, one lies beneath the surface of our awareness. And it turns out to be far more important than we may have thought. And so interoception talks about a momentary bodily sensation. It's not just checking in and saying, oh, I feel what's going on in here, I've got this, all right, check, done, and off to the next thing. But it's about being able to stay with sensation and then float onto the next and the next and the next. So interoceptive awareness, the conditions, you might say, are as follows. Momentary awareness, as we said, without, and this is important, any preconceptions of what we'll find. No predictive quality, as in the experiment where you're given a drug to increase heart rate and anxiety. And then the third is also important, without fixing sensation on one point in the body. Now, how many of you work with chronic pain and depression? So you will know already that people tend to fix with chronic pain sensation in one spot. My shoulder hurts, this is how it feels. In 5 minutes, here's the prediction, it will feel like this. 5 minutes later, it will be like this, and it's not changing at all, no matter what I do. So there's that element missing of interoceptive awareness. I'm working on a current book where I'm looking at types of interoceptive disorder, which we'll touch on a little bit later. And then this one is the hardest for those of us who are yogis, without a sense of mastery. You could say that mastery is the opposite of mindfulness in many ways. And as such, it's also the opposite of interoceptive awareness. When we know this territory on the inside, we're not doing interoception. We're just showing off a little. Right? And so we can talk about this amongst ourselves and say, what would it be like as a quote-unquote advanced yogi or a yoga therapist to say, I don't know what's happening in here right now? And how freeing might that be for our clients, for the people that come to us and don't know either? Maybe have gone through their whole lives not really understanding or inhabiting this wilderness that lies within us. So interoception, when we practice it, this wilderness of the body, when we go in again and again and again without predicting what we'll find, without staying fixed, and with a sense of vulnerability rather than mastery, this wilderness of the body starts to feel like home to us. We get a sense of our own resilience, that we can enter this wilderness at any time, and we can be okay there. We can survive and even thrive, that we can handle the unpredictable, and we also get a sense of the transient nature of sensory awareness. And when we hear that phrase as yogis, we start to think about this ability to watch also our chitta vritti, this fluctuation of emotional and mental awareness that we go through as well. It turns out that the development of this visceral resilience also helps us develop emotional resilience as well. The two are closely connected and are being researched, and we'll go over that a little bit. So, just to pause and land for a moment where we are, this visceral resilience and the transient nature of sensory experience that we get a sense of and a familiarity with, that helps develop emotional resilience, and it helps us to be able to be okay with the transience of our emotional and mental fluctuations, and to begin to differentiate self from not self, me from not me. So very important to us as yogis. So we think about what kind of interoception do we want, and you know, in many countries, as in America here, anything we do becomes a performance. Are you good at interoceptive awareness? Because I'm pretty good, you know. So I wanted to caution you. I was teaching in London not long ago, and people were saying, well, there was 20 seconds in this practice when I wasn't really doing it. That's a pretty darn good practice if you have only 20 seconds without. So soft focus interoceptive awareness, where we're not doing it too hard, but just allowing us to rest, you know, to fluctuate in that interoceptive space. So I'd love to shine the spotlight now on interoception and emotional health and healing. And in particular, researchers have done some interesting work zeroing in on the body scan part of MBSR, of mindfulness-based stress reduction, which originally was very body-based, and now as it's evolved over time, has maybe become a little bit more mental of an exercise, and I think it's being brought back to the body by John Kabat-Zinn for sure. But zeroing in on this body scan, the research shows, and this is Norman Farb's work, that it increases plasticity in the medial and anterior parts of the insula. Those are the mindfulness centers of the brain, very, very important, and also helps us with empathy and compassion. And that interoceptive awareness turns out to be a critical component of mindfulness itself, that bodily awareness that fluctuates. So when we look at anxiety and depression, we can say that there's a high degree of default mode network, which is thinking about the past and how it should be different, thinking about what we have here in the present and wishing something was different, projecting into the future, and then also making everything about us, but in a kind of a negative way. It turns out that negative self-reference is one of the most important elements of default mode. So Norm and other researchers have honed in on that because it's so correlated with depression, but also in relapse after treatment for depression. So also in depression and anxiety, there's a tendency to have bodily sensations that are too loud, that become too prominent, and not having the ability to turn down or to move off of those sensations. That volume knob can't turn down. And there is something called alpha modulation, and in depression and anxiety, they don't modulate alpha very well. So what is this alpha that I'm mentioning here? This is the angina monologues. So in chronic pain, I feel like as a woman I can put this up here. So then Dr. Platt says to me, I'm going to drug you up with this new beta blocker some schmuck from Avenue 2 Labs sold me. And I tell him, forget it, Buster. And I spin around and march out of the office. Next thing you know, I'm at Waldbaum's, and suddenly I feel so much chest pain that I have to lie down and die right in the middle of aisle 6. But do I? I don't think so. So it's that kind of rumination on negative sensation, those sensations that are too loud. And so alpha wave modulation has to do with wakeful relaxation. It's reduced when our eyes are open. When it's firing in non-REM, it's very connected with fibromyalgia. So alpha wave modulation has to do with our ability to pay attention to some sensations, but turn the volume knob down on other sensations, to be very discerning, and we could think of that as vijnanamaya kosha, about what we listen to and when. So there's an ignoring that happens, a tuning out as well. Some of the research on alpha, particularly in the body scan part of MBSR, shows that the shifting spotlight on momentary fluctuations of sensation generalizes across the whole sensory cortex. In particular, and this is really cool, it generalizes up to include the regulation of thoughts. So it ties right back in to that self-referential, very negative mode that happens in depression. So by learning how to work with sensations, we can get better at learning how to work with and regulate uncomfortable thoughts and emotions. That's Catherine Kerr's work. And this idea of involution or management of the senses, we could frame that a little bit as, how do I listen, when do I listen, and when do I move off sensations? And there's a very delicate dance and a balance that's always happening within us. So why body awareness? What's this going to do for us? When we look at the body and interoceptive awareness, we're both the observer and the observed at the same time. And when we think about that, we think about the seer and the seen in the Yoga Sutras. So it's a really neat way to differentiate between the two. It's not that the body may, and this is my bias, distract us from enlightenment, but it might actually help us make those very important differentiations. So there's a kind of movement that's being studied now, which is called movement-based embodied contemplative practices. As you might imagine, yoga is not quite considered to be in that category, in part because we see it as so proprioceptive. So the neuroscientists are studying Tai Chi a lot more than yoga. And what they're finding in these Tai Chi practitioners is that there's a stronger ability to modulate alpha, to turn down the volume knob on some sensations, turn up other sensations. And they're better able to tune out the narrative, that negative self-referential narrative mode, and better able to stay with sensory intelligence. Very important. After practicing Tai Chi, and they found that the more years of practice Tai Chi practitioners had, the better they were able to stay with sensory intelligence and really control the volume knobs on sensation. So the key takeaways from this study is that there's a lot of benefits to these movement-based and embodied contemplative practices. They dim the intensity of the negative self-reference that's associated with depression and relapse from depression. They help with alpha wave modulation and lowering the intensity of bodily sensations that are too loud, as is the case with chronic pain and depression. Norm Farb, Dave Vago, and I are studying interoceptive awareness in depression in 3 groups. One is a movement-based embodied contemplative yoga practice. The other is power yoga, and the third is cardiovascular exercise. So we're hoping to, and we're looking at depression scores. So we're hoping to show that as opposed to a proprioceptive practice, which is more like power yoga, can a contemplative practice of yoga actually increase interoceptive awareness and turn down the volume knob on this negative self-reference and default mode. This is Norm and Dave at the Mind and Life Conference, looking very studious. So what we can imagine is that a healthy life and well-being might be developing the ability to know which aspects of our bodily self to listen to at any given time. Sensory awareness, movement, thought, sensation, or vision as well. And that we have the ability to shine this attentional spotlight, as it's called, on certain aspects of our experience that can inform discernment and evolution. So we want to tune in, tune out, and turn on. Right? So let's talk a little bit for a moment about body maps in the time that we have left. A body map is your brain's representation of your body. Your brain has a space, if you will, for every part of your body. And when a body part goes missing, the brain doesn't like that very much. And going missing can be either losing a limb or it can be becoming disembodied. So let's look at what happens here and about physical health. So I'd like to talk briefly about the rubber hand illusion. And in the rubber hand illusion, how many of you are familiar with that? So basically you go and put your one hand or arm goes off a table, and then there's one of your arms and the rubber arm. And the experimenter says, can you imagine that this rubber arm might be your own? That sounds like a stretch, doesn't it? Kind of hard to imagine. But you say, all right, I'll try. And then they take a paintbrush and stroke really softly. Now, stroking softly, that's an interoceptive cue. The rubber hand that's not yours and your own hand at the same time. And pretty soon you start to feel a sense of tingling and weirdness, and that rubber hand starts to feel like your own, and the other hand that's out of sight does not. And suddenly the researcher takes a hammer and pounds it down on the rubber hand, and you jump. But that was a rubber hand, not your own hand. You shouldn't feel any pain or any surprise. So the rubber hand illusion actually talks about, it's a great test of embodiment. And it looks at how we can disown certain parts of our body as not being ours and adopt other things that are not us as our own. It's kind of a bodily self-error, and it also turns out to be an immune self-error as well. So adopting a foreign body part as yours, like the rubber arm, or disowning a body part like the arm that's under the table. So what that means is that for a lot of us, just to break it down, seeing can trump feeling. Our vision or thought can trump our sensory intelligence at times when it's not so helpful to us. So Catherine Kerr went back and looked at Tai Chi practitioners again and found that they were better able in the rubber hand illusion to stay with their sensory intelligence, not to feel that the rubber hand was their own, not to disown that their own arm as not being theirs. And that the more years of practice they had, the more this ability to stay with sensory intelligence remained. So if you're not able to stay with sensory intelligence, you can't turn down this default mode, this self-referential mode, and that's correlated with increased scores on the Beck depression inventory. So the idea here is that jumping to the cognitive evaluation over sensory awareness can be maladaptive. And it can also signify a lack of curiosity about our sensory experience. So there are some surprises. Here they are. In the rubber hand illusion, something happened with that disowned body part. Temperature drops in that body part, and there's inflammation happening. There's an increased histamine-related inflammatory response in that disowned part, but not in other parts of the body. Not in other parts of the body. So we start to look at the fact that disembodiment, not being in our bodies, not inhabiting the interoceptive space, activates our immune alarm system. When we think about slow motion contemplative practices such as Tai Chi, they seem to, and what we think is true, and Kathy is replicating this now, to enhance immune function. And this whole connection is strengthened by the nervous system, vagal tone, immune system link. And just this week, brain function was found to be correlated, I don't know how many of you saw the study, to a newly discovered area of lymph vessels in the brain that we didn't think were there. And I'm using we in a royal sense. So experienced mindfulness practitioners, and this is Richie Davidson's study, an 8-hour session, were able to reduce the expression of pro-inflammatory genes. Satvir, I think, alluded to that same study. We know that trauma can make it difficult to be in the body, and sometimes disembodiment is a survival tactic. It's an adaptive coping skill. But I also want to say that not being in the body, not being embodied, is itself a form of trauma. And it's a trauma not just emotionally, but to the brain as well. In studies of thoracolumbar spine pain, where you would imagine there's increased signaling, tissue signaling, it was actually found that there's a deficit in interoceptive signals, not increased signaling. And so this pain signal is the brain's way of saying, The tissue here has been destroyed. I need to signal pain. That's an alarm response. It may not be what we've thought it to be. It's missing fascial nerves. And so looking at the idea that the sensation of not being in the body is experienced by our brain as trauma. And pain and disembodiment is trauma. And pain is one of the ways that our brain calls us back into the body, says, come back home. So when part of that body map is lost, the alarm is sounded, and that's an adaptive response. As you already know, it's very hard to teach people to inhabit a body that's already in pain. And that's done in a very delicate way, a little bit at a time. So chronic pain, anxiety, depression, and mystery inflammatory illnesses, which are on the rise, are all ways, perhaps, of the brain calling us back into our bodies, asking us to come home. Phantom limb pain, as well, is another manifestation of that. There's signaling of pain in a part of the body that's not there. So interoceptive disorders are now being thought of as anxiety, depression, chronic pain, IBS and gut disorders, eating disorders, and other addictions. They're now being known as diseases of disembodiment, as disorders of interoceptive awareness. So it may not be the method of yoga or Tai Chi or embodied practice that we do that counts, but the degree of interoceptive awareness. And as yogis and healers, we want to be looking at this new practice and study space and saying, well, how do we know if someone's in their body or not? How do we know if we're in our own bodies or not? How would we measure that together? What would anchors for interoception awareness be in our clients? How do we teach people to go in to this wilderness of the body in a safe way? Some of these hot spots are feet, abdomen, pelvis, upper spine, throat, jaw, cervical spine, and they also happen to improve a vagal tone as well. So embodiment is good for the nervous system, disembodiment, not so happy. So this is rich soil for us to explore together, to move from yoga as proprioceptive practice to interoceptive practices, to that internal sense of gnosis or knowing in the body, to embodied awareness. What are we practicing in our own practice? And what are we teaching? And it's not that exteroception and proprioception are no longer good enough for us, but how do we have a dance between those forms of awareness when it makes the most sense? How do we coordinate them like a very beautiful symphony of awarenesses within us? It's been said that if you change your mind, you change your brain and body. And so there's a lot of focus on mind training. My personal bias and my clinical bias is also that if you change your body, you can change your mind and brain. Changing the body can change the mind and brain. So the Gita talks about sattvic happiness. Sattvic happiness in the beginning is like poison. It's not so easy to go into this wilderness. Sometimes it's like a vacation home that we haven't cleaned for a really long time, and there are cobwebs everywhere, and people have come in and taken things, and squirrels are camping out. But when we come again and again into this wilderness and we bring our clients there, it becomes like nectar in the end. And it has a vast influence on our well-being. So the key takeaways, just to wrap up here, is that interoceptive awareness is very distinct from good movement and beautiful poses. It's the cornerstone of our bodily self, this ability to choose from the smorgasbord of sensory awareness, vision, thought, movement. It's key to emotional balance. It's related to our immune self. It helps with the flexibility of our attentional spotlight, with paying attention, and the stilling of the fluctuations of our mind through sensory experience, and absolutely vital to our health. So the body really is and can be not just this thing that we need to slough off, but a vehicle to enlightenment. So I want to thank you so much for your embodiment today.